Thank you. My name's Andy Dennison. I'm a friend of Steve's, and when he asked me to be the introducer of at this event, I was a little bit perplexed, and as is my nature, I went to the dark side and figured that there was something going on. Because people like Sean Murphy and Bonnie Black and Bart Scott certainly had a lot more to do with the construction of your book than I did. So I was thinking that, you know, perhaps it was the fact that I can get him on the golf course for free. Maybe perhaps the reason why he's given me this opportunity. And then I thought perhaps it was the fact that when I quit the English department, he had just that many more 102 papers to read. But
so it's sweet revenge.
Sweet revenge.
Yeah.
But then I read the book, and I found out why he had asked me. Steve and I have an incredible parallel series of experiences in Greece, about 3 or 4 years apart. And so as I'm reading through here, I'm seeing everything you see, because they're familiar. Those pictures over there, that's practically my backyard. So it really was, well, we'll do a couple things. You were there 67, 8, 9?
I got there right before my birthday in 68.
68.
And left in the summer of 69.
Okay. He got there when the colonels of the military junta were just settling in. And they had many more adversaries to silence or throw out on the little islands all over the Aegean where they had their prisons. And I got there about 3 or 4 years later because my sister had traveled to Greece and fell in love with a Greek and married a Greek, and end of story. So I was coming to visit her, and the colonels had settled in. It was a good old-fashioned military coup, military government, and the roads were great, and the trains were running on time, and the buses were on time. And I stayed at the Air Force Base with a friend where Steve was stationed. I, too, got to drive around Athens a lot like he did because my friend was a veterinarian in the veterinary service, and we went and checked food as it came in to the base. And so I also was introduced to the serpentine labyrinth of Athens and the roads. And I was thinking perhaps that there was a metaphor out there for that. And there are no right angles in Greece. None. It's only by accident that there are right angles. The roads never go exactly 90 degrees, nor does the landscape, as you can see, ever go 90 degrees. And so I was thinking that that's sort of a good, Greece is a great place for metaphors. And so this was a great metaphor for a life, because there are no right angles. And even though all of us would love to have a couple of right angles in there every once in a while, they don't seem to come up when you want them. So it was a nice way of thinking about what I was reading. And then when I started, I was reading through this, and I knew the places, and I recognized the words, and the way Steve, who, in case you don't know, is an American one of the original American studies majors in the United States. And so he's a culturalist. He loves culture, and he sees it and observes it very well. So as you read through these pages, even if you don't know anything about Greece, you will learn about the Greek culture, the Greeks, their food, their language, the smell of souvlaki. So it's just a great honor for me to do this for you, my brother. And I wanted to finish with the quote, the Greek quote, which is right here. It's the epitaph for Kazantzakis. I hope for nothing, I fear nothing, I am free.
Thank you, man. There you go, brother. Lovely.
Wow.
Yeah, Andy, in addition to being a regular for many years with the Taos News. He happened to hire me when I needed a job down at UNM-Taos, and turned out to be a great guy to hang out with, and not as bad in golf as I am, but not that much better that I felt like an idiot. I want to thank Philip Barais for this wonderful opportunity to use his gallery. This event would surely not have happened had it not been for my wonderful wife, Donna LaFergie, who just took a big bite of something. And also our friends Michelle and Michelle Marion and Lynn Blyler Strong. Thank you all. I mean, something like this takes so much longer than you think. This is actually a double book launch because this was my first book, and it came out in 1991, back when publishers would say, "We'll do the cover for you, don't worry, we'll get it edited for you, and then we'll do some PR for you, we'll have you go around and stuff." But I was in Greece at the time. Wait, I was in Germany. I was in Germany teaching on a Fulbright. And everybody said, "We can't get a hold of you. The mail doesn't work," blah, 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 BS. And then by the time I got back to the States, they said, "Well, we can't do any PR now. The book's been out 6 months." So I actually was headed into a tough time with my second wife, and went through a divorce and 3 teenage boys that I helped raise. And so I never got to read it in public. So this is the launch. This is about... I knew down the road somewhere I would have a chance to inflict this book on somebody. And I'll, just to assure you, I'm going to read the blurb on the back. Toxic Work is a sensitive and gripping tale of electronics workers who suffered enormous toxic injury and organized an effective legal attack. Steve Fox successfully brings together issues of labor organizing, gender, work roles, minorities, and toxic hazards. This is a valuable contribution to the small but growing numbers of case studies of toxic wastes and collective action against corporations. Some of you may have heard of G.T.E. Lenkirk. They fled Silicon Valley in 1971 looking for a docile workforce. And they found one in Albuquerque. The fathers, and it was truly the fathers of Albuquerque, turned out and gave them a huge welcome, gave them anything they wanted, actually gave them a building. It's out on I-40, right around Eubank. In the last 5 years, it was found to be heavily polluted over the Albuquerque groundwater from the secrets of electronics manufacturing, which is that it uses solvents and toxic salts of gold and copper and silver. And it is heavily dangerous, especially to women who don't ever appear in the studies. The Centers for Disease Control and I forget the other acronym of the workplace toxics outfit, has based their safe load of toluene, which is everywhere, on 9 subjects, all of them middle-class, healthy, white males from the Northeast. So, women who have smaller bodies and other differences are never even taken into account. I'll try to read just a few short things and then get on to the other book that you know about. But this book was my baby, and reading from page 13. This book is the sole public record of 6 years of legal and medical investigation into the lives of some 250 high-tech workers. Several studies have been published by occupational health researchers who volunteered their time to study the plaintiffs during 1988 and 89. I cite their articles here. This book includes the crucial testimony of expert medical witnesses for both sides, revealing the role of personality and ideology on professional testimony in court, and the distortions that professional testimony can make of working class subjects. The book is based on 100,000 pages of pretrial discovery documents and hundreds of hours of interviews. GTE corporate executives and attorneys decided to prohibit all non-plaintiff employees from giving interviews except under deposition. Let me shorten this just a little bit. This book is the story of chance encounters. It's the story of the power of personality and position in corporate life and in local, state, and national public health and labor agencies. It's thus a study not only of one controversial electronics company, but of the archaic, random, narrowly focused, and penurious set of institutions, not a real system, that many injured workers must rely on for support. It is also a window on some of the consequences of the atmosphere surrounding high-tech development in the last 20 years, now the last 40 years. The uncritical enthusiasm, the unconditional belief in high-tech as a panacea, and the futuristic optimism shared by political and industrial power brokers as they look toward the prophesied post-industrial information age. The story of the GTE Lenkirk workers supports the argument made in recent books critical of the unbounded faith in microelectronics manufacturing. The first plaintiff. In August 1984, a young woman walked into the Albuquerque law office of Josephine de Leon Rohr. Rohr, although only 2 years out of law school, did not need walk-in clients. Contracted to the local office of a national firm, she was making good money for the first time in her life. She specialized in collections, personal injury, and workers' compensation. In 1955, at the age of 16, Josephine de Leon had fled her native Dominican Republic after her two best friends had been murdered by dictator Rafael Trujillo for their participation in a student anti-dictatorship group. You might have seen their story in Time of the Butterflies. They were called Las Mariposas. They were elite, from an elite family, but they were against Trujillo, and you didn't go against Trujillo, just like you don't go against Putin these days. Josephine moved to California, had 3 children before she was 21, then was divorced from their father and supported her family as a bilingual paralegal in a rural legal assistance program. Her second husband died in Vietnam, and her oldest son died suddenly of leukemia at 18 as she was beginning law school in 1978. So by 1984, after what seemed a lifetime of scrambling and loss, Josephine de Leon was looking forward to some peace and stability. The woman who walked in her office that day in August, Amy Cordova Romero, was in desperate crisis. Rohr at first took her for a teenager, but she was actually 37 and struggling through chemotherapy and complications associated with metastasized ovarian cancer. Divorced, jobless, with no health insurance, she owed St. Joseph Hospital $70,000, and the hospital was suing her for title to the fourplex in which she and her teenage son lived. Deeded to her in a divorce settlement, it was her only property and her only source of income. Her parents were in their 80s and near death, and her ex-husband paid child support only erratically. It seemed a pathetic situation. You know, Josephine spoke with a very pronounced Dominican accent, and so forgive me if I get it a little bit wrong. You don't look like the stereotype we have of the terminal cancer patient. You seem so young. I know, but plenty of the girls I worked with have been sick and lost their uteruses and stuff. And they were as young as me. Some were younger. Plenty of them? Asked Rohr. How many did you work with? About 25 or 30, Amy said. All of them had hysterectomies. All of them? That's impossible, said Rohr. Are you serious? Who are they? Amy began naming names, and Rohr scribbled them down. When she had about 10 women, Amy said, there are more, lots more. I can't think of them all right now. We worked at GTE Lenkert making electronics things. I worked there for most of the 70s. There were all these chemicals we were always smelling and getting on ourselves. But since I've been in the hospital, I've heard that nearly everybody we worked with has had operations, mostly hysterectomies, and lots have had cancer. Word got around, and women started calling Rohr's office. Before she had even written the hospital's attorney on Amy's behalf, she had notepads filled with lists, human organs that she hadn't even heard of, ill women with Hispanic names, chemicals that sounded oddly familiar, even feminine, ethylene, urethane, methyl something, trichlor, something that sounded like bleach. She tried to imagine the factory production line. Where would Amy and her friends be? What would they be doing? Thus began Josephine Rohr's chance investigation into the life and health of Amy Cordova Romero and 250 other former GTE workers, nearly all women and mostly Hispanic. A novice who had never tried a case. Josephine de Leon was taking on one of the top 20 multinational corporations in the United States with defiance, naivete, and moral outrage. Mortgaging her house, borrowing money, improvising, as she said, like a bull in a china shop, clinging to faith in the system and finding activist allies when she needed them most. Rohr battled GTE for nearly 3 years. Her campaign uncovered ruthless management, a toxic arsenal of electronics chemicals, and a stratified workforce where minority women did meaningless, repetitive work under dangerously contaminated conditions. Amy told her in her deposition, it got to the point finally that I was like choking. I couldn't take it anymore, so I finally told my son and my boyfriend I was dying. I couldn't eat nothing for weeks, and I choked if I laid flat. I was completely out of breath. That's when I told the doctors, well, do whatever you want. So they called my sister-in-law, and she took me into the emergency room. I couldn't lie flat for the x-rays, so they brought some kind of portable scanner thing in. None of the doctors could figure out what was wrong with me. Finally, she said, this Asian doctor got the portable scanner going and gasped and ran to the phone. He called other doctors and said, I found it. The scanner had located the source of the pressure on Amy's breathing. Malignant pericardium, a heart sac attacked by cancer cells and filled with blood. After treating her hemopericardium and pneumonia, doctors diagnosed chronic restrictive pulmonary disease. She had never smoked, had no family history. She underwent a hysterectomy with removal of her ovaries and the omentum. Chemotherapy began. Let me skip to the back. I quote on the last page the wonderful sociologist Robert Bellah, B-E-L-L-A-H, at UC Berkeley, who says, quote, perhaps life is not a race whose only goal is being foremost. We will need to remember that we did not create ourselves, that we owe what we are to the communities that formed us, and to what Paul Tillich called the structure of grace in history that made such communities possible. We will need to see the story of our lives on this earth not as an unbroken success, but as a history of suffering as well as joy. We'll need to remember the millions of suffering people in the world today and the millions whose suffering in the past made our present affluence possible. The Albuquerque workers of GTE tell us a story that was almost silenced, locked in the technical jargon of medical records and discarded with sealed depositions. They are not representative of all American workers. They never presumed to take over management responsibility for guiding the affairs of General Telephone and Electric Corporation. They are casualties from the shifting front lines of the information age. How ironic that the manufacture of some of the most powerful communications equipment ever made involved workers denied the power of their own voices. And yet, this is the end of it. The story from GTE carries the good news of a hard-fought victory for worker compensation. Occasionally, as in this case, tort law, sacrifice, decent judges, and a spirit of voluntarism by legal and medical advocates can level the playing field between massive corporations and workers from the shop floor. This book has been an account of what Dennis Hayes has called a controlled chemical catastrophe. It is also an account of the unified commitment that underlies all popular change. So there's one or two copies left out there, and you can get it on online. Just look for it. I asked the publisher if they would give me the copyright so that I could work with it, and they said, "Oh no, we like having your book in our catalog." And so then they offered me a great 40% off, so that I was going to buy 20 books and bring them here, but you know the price was still $27 a book or something like that, even in paperback. So it was like. GTE is not a fun story. When you finally get it into court, the lawyers go to work and whittled it down. They whittled it all the way down to one chemical that they had to prove was responsible for everything. And of course, you can't do that. And so GTE, of course, got out the checkbook and said, well, this has been fun. Let me just write checks to your worst damaged people. And they did. You know, people got between $10,000 and $40,000. And the ones at the high end were permanently disabled. And the trouble with electronics and with chemicals is that you can't prove that this exposure on this day caused that tumor. Anyway. Now to the book at hand. I came to Athens after almost a year in Mississippi, in Biloxi on the coast. I had never even heard that Mississippi had a coast. It's gorgeous. You know, Mississippi has a little foot going down to the coast, and so does Alabama. So they each have beaches. And Mississippi has a huge Air Force base. It's the biggest Air Force base ever in terms of training, and still is. It's where the Tuskegee Airmen were trained back in the 40s. 7,000 black troops were there in the middle 40s. I cannot imagine. It must have been surrounded by Klansmen. So I learned in Mississippi how people were resisting the Air Force from within. I had been drafted, for those of you who never heard this story, I had been drafted while I was a grad student in English at the University of Texas in Austin. I was also the newsman at LBJ's radio TV station, and all of that didn't matter. I dropped one course from a horrible professor and didn't replace it for a couple of weeks, and by then they had reported me as dropping below full time. Selective Service sent me a letter immediately, And so I was ordered to report to my choice of the services. And so I chose the Army. I had a BA, so I chose the Signal Corps because it was 2 years.
Right.
And I thought, okay, that's 2 years. And then on my way to say goodbye to my old roommate from undergraduate days, Jim Como, who is the guy at the top of the stairs in that sepia-toned photo, I went to say goodbye to him. And the last ride hitching in to see him was an Air Force regional recruiting coordinator who helped me understand the error of my ways and switched me on the spot to the Air Force. I arrived about 4 days before my 24th birthday in Athens, Greece, after having lied to the Air Force and telling them that my American girlfriend was in fact, was really my fiance, and wouldn't they like to maybe keep the family together? Her father was stationed on the main spy base we had in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was on Heraklion, Crete, the biggest Greek island of Crete. And they bought it, and they sent me there, and I thought, I have no problem with having lied, because the bigger lie was that we all needed to be sucked up and sent to Vietnam. And as you all, I'm sure, have begun to read about that or reflect on it, it was this horrible, tragic mistake in the Greek sense. That LBJ, we now know from the 4 incredible books written about him, didn't want to do it, was against it, but he didn't want to admit that he was the first president to lose a war. And so as he built the society that we live in, with Medicare, Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act, we're at the 50th anniversary, it's all on the news, the Voting Rights Act, these titanic things that change us from a Ku Klux Klan nation to now a crypto Tea Party nation. His fatal flaw was, no, whatever the Pentagon wants. The year I went in, they doubled the number of people in Vietnam from 180,000 to 360,000. And I was one of the ones who wiggled away, got into the Air Force instead. And this is the scene, which will sound somewhat familiar to those of us who are reading the news and feel like there's too much shifting going on in the world. In the days after my birthday, the worldwide outbreaks of freedom-loving dissent continued to dominate the news. When our officers, we had half of Athens International Airport. It was called Atheni Base. And I even met a Greek guy at Marin County Grecian Festival 3 weeks ago, who said, there was no Atheni Base. What are you talking about? I said, I served in it. It's half of Athens International Airport at the time. And he continued wagging his finger at me until an older Greek guy came and took him by the elbow and said, shut up, there was. I was there, you're forgetting. So, you know, even many Greeks have forgotten. When our officers checked the squadron teletype machines, they always exclaimed about stories of upheavals. On August 20th, 2 days after my birthday, the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia with 750,000 Warsaw Pact troops, 6,500 tanks, 800 planes. Czechoslovakia. It was the biggest operation in Europe since the end of World War II. The Russians didn't like the Czechs enjoying their Prague Spring and their Velvet Revolution under Alexander Dubček. This massive invasion was only 700 miles from Greece, right up the Adriatic. The Russian tanks rumbling through Prague were so much closer to our base than they were to NATO headquarters, and so much farther from the United States. My boss, Colonel Fisher, promptly left Athens to attend 2 all-day meetings of Air Force commanders to get briefing about Washington's plans for our region's response. A week later, or actually, let's see, 4 more days after that event, clashes began between police and anti-war protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We had followed the buildup to this clash in Chicago through alternative newspapers when I was in Biloxi, from a Johnny Appleseed-like solo distributor who wore leather pants and got arrested in every town from New Orleans to Pensacola for delivering these leftist rags. It started out as the spring mobilization to end the war in Vietnam, drawing hundreds of thousands to a march from New York's Central Park to the United Nations building in March of 1967. Distinguished peace activists like David Dellinger, Father Louis Berrigan of Boston, Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Benjamin Spock, all spoke at that rally. Then 35,000 people marched from the Lincoln Memorial to the Pentagon, including writer Norman Mailer, who memorialized this surreal event by having his alter ego, Aquarius, describe being arrested along with 650 others. The yippie wing of the protesters was hilarious to me. It was political theater, as if staged by Robin Hood, Ken Kesey, Lenny Bruce, and the Merry Pranksters. I was quietly pulling for them as I went about my office duties. My immediate supervisor, Captain Al Citron, pulled up a chair by my desk and asked me if I approved of the Hoffman and Rubin people and the media's portraits of the ragtag yippies who threatened to put LSD in the Chicago water system, in addition to levitating and exorcising the Pentagon. Captain Al was curious, but I was careful. I bet, he said, you're glad you're not serving near Chicago, right? Sounds pretty messy. So, Steve, you think that kind of anarchism is helpful? I don't think they're anarchists, Al, in the old sense of anything goes. They're doing mass demonstrations like blacks did with a touch of put on. They love teasing the straight world with satire. I smiled and looked him in the eyes. Levitating the Pentagon? Exorcising it? That's a joke. They're doing it to get the right-wingers riled up and to get press attention to their protests. But those mass demonstrations and the police reactions to them are pretty much the same as the Selma March and Memphis March by black garbage men. Well, he said, that's right. The blacks did go through that too. That was a good tactic for them. But you know, the civil rights people, they had religion on their side. They did their marches with such dignity. They didn't make jokes and threats, don't you think? They had morality on their side, didn't they? I was impressed that Al Citron was even discussing this with me. I swiveled my chair and faced him, enjoying this thoughtful dialogue. You're right about religion, Al, but there are lots of clergy in this anti-war movement. I named them. Said Al, I guess I don't read much about that religious aspect. I guess what bothers me, Steve, is why middle-class kids have to get so wild with that hair and those headbands and beards. They aren't in the war. They haven't had a bad life compared to blacks. But the draft, Al, it's why I'm here with you. It's taking everybody it can reach, even though the country doesn't support the war and LBJ quit over it. I kept reminding myself to enjoy this discussion and keep my emotions in check. I think, Al, we have to see how long it took blacks marching and nonviolent demonstrating and being beaten up and jailed. I think the anti-war coalitions think, with over 100,000 dead in Vietnam so far, and that's just the people of their side we can count, and no end in sight, we can't wait 8 more years like the civil rights movement had to. I thought to myself, it's great that I can talk to this Al guy, but it won't be easy tiptoeing around the colonel and the major. It's like acting in a movie. But this is the price of getting here to Athens. The Air Force is paying my way. After I toured the whole country, courtesy of the Air Force, I found a notice on the base bulletin board for Greek lessons, and I called that number. It turned out to be a half-Greek, half-British woman named Jean, who was a licensed guide at Corinth, Delphi, and all the other archaeological sites. I told her my name and asked to meet her. "Certainly, Stephanie," she answered, and gave me directions. "Stephanie?" I said. "Isn't that the female version of Stephen?" "Oh, it's with an E, not an I-E," she said. "We call you here Stephanos when talking about you, and Stephanie when talking to you," she said. I went to her family's apartment thinking, well, this is a way I can learn some Greek. She was short, spoke upper-class British English, had brown hair swept up into a ducktail, brown eyes with lavender eyeshadow, and was cute and energetic. Her mother was polite but grave and suspicious. I hit it off with Jean and decided to meet her once a week. I met with her a few days later at a tiny table in the living room of her parents' apartment. Her father had been British consul in Athens. Her mother was Greek. Jean became my language teacher and first Greek oracle. As I thought, she was very conservative, but she taught me some classical Greek, some street Greek, and lots of myths and history. Our studying turned animated, and we leaned closer, looking at pictures in books and at her handwritten word lessons. She loved words. I loved words. She knew several languages and could gossip about the Greek gods and goddesses as if they were her family. I began to feel tingles at the back of my neck listening to her, and then her fragrance drifted into my nostrils. Then our fingers touched. I had tingles all over now. We were doomed. It started innocently enough. On our third lesson, Jean realized that I needed some basic tutoring on how to write Greek in its Cyrillic alphabet. The capitals were hard enough. D is a triangle. S was an E. A had no crossbar. A small I with an N. A small I was an N with a tail. Theta and pi weren't math. They were letters. And when Jean wrote in Cyrillic cursive, the letters lost any familiarity of the algebra and the characters on fraternity houses. Her cursive version of Stephanos might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. She would write a Greek word, then print it and swivel the page so I could read it, holding her finger at the upsilon or ypsilon, and my hand, tracing the letters, came softly into contact with hers. We went on to the next vowel or consonant giving me trouble. Delta or gamma or kappa. Our knees and fingers began to touch as we pored over our lessons. Her mother spied on us, sneaking quietly into the kitchen from a back room. Jean told me later that her mother had said, "Him, the American. I don't see him well." She felt the vibes and smelled the pheromones all the way back in the back room. Her daughter was engaged to a proper older Greek man, but was now sitting at the tiny table with this Ami. That's short for American. This is my friend Ami. On the fourth lesson, I brought her Leonard Cohen's new poetry book, The Spice Box of Earth. The cover of the paperback was an open box covered with designs, including a tasteful nude woman on one side. We looked into each other's eyes when we took a break and agreed that it would be a good change of pace to meet the next time at the Athens Hilton for a late evening recap of our progress so far in cursive. And 2 days later, we sat in a dark corner in the Delphine bar at the Hilton. Could not keep our hands off of each other under the table. "You leave first, Stephanie," she said. "Wait in the alley. I'll follow in 5 minutes." I left money for the bill on the table and went out a back door, the location of which she drew for me on her napkin. In the twilight, I saw her shut the hotel door behind her and come down the loading dock steps. We swept into an embrace in the dark, her purse falling to the pavement, our mouths fusing together, our hands caressing. Jean and I canceled the language lessons at her family's apartment. And surprise, we began meeting in her car on Athens streets. At night or on remote suburban streets during the day. The physical attraction had hit us like a squall in the Saronic Gulf. After my girlfriend Debler and a certain person, let's see, what is the word? A certain hooker named the Gobbler, Jean was totally 50s with her cashmere sweaters and scarves around her neck and stockings and a girdle. Parked on a quiet street, we almost went horizontal in the front seats of my VW, dodging the shift lever. It was an odd throwback to parking and necking with high school girlfriends in my mother's car back in Dallas, fearing discovery and rushing intimacy in the awkward spaces of a car. But this was in Athens with an engaged woman who, I thought, certainly must know what she was doing. I had never tried going to third base with somebody wearing a girdle. It was thick and tight, an effective barrier, and my hand almost went numb under the layers of elastic. It was a contraceptive garment. The fact that she didn't help me or use her superb English brought things to a standstill. She said she had to leave anyway. The next time I saw her, I asked her to go to a movie downtown, and she said she couldn't be seen with me in public because of her fiancé. I've been engaged to Yorgos for 3 years. I don't want a scandal, Stephen. I want to keep leading tours. So where is this going? I asked. Oh, it doesn't mean we can't see each other. We can meet at various places, but no one must know. So what if your fiancé catches us? We'll make sure he won't. You Americans, you're so puritanical. Greeks understand this. My parents arranged the marriage, and I like you. She laughed at my innocence. Me, puritanical, I thought? If only she knew about Deborah or the Glyphata Gobbler. Then a sobering thought hit me. Was I Jean's gobbler? The truth was I didn't really like Jean. I turned toward her and said, look, I don't want to have to sneak around to see you, Jean. I don't want to have an engaged girlfriend. Another sobering thought came. According to the Air Force, I'm engaged too. We were parked behind the Archaeological Museum, where many of Jean's tours started, on Bubulina Street. I'm only going to be here for 2 years, I told her. I don't want to spend what time I've got this way. But why only 2 years? Can't you have a career with your military here? Move up the ladder? No, I'm a draftee, Jean, and I'd never extend any time in the military. As soon as my enlistment is up, in 2 years, I'm out of here. She sighed, looked at me, looked out the window. What do you want then, Stephanie? I looked away. Even though I thought I had just told her, it wasn't that easy to answer. None of the girls I'd ever dated had ever asked me that. In fact, none of my friends had ever asked me that. I'd never asked a girlfriend that, or asked myself what I wanted in a girl either. Faint bouzouki music drifted to us from the radio of a passing car. A woman pushed a baby stroller and herded 2 toddlers across the street ahead of us. I have an outsider spirit now, despite being in the military. This Jean is a consummate upper-class insider. Not my cup of Retsina. Gene, I want to be with someone who's free to be with me. I don't want to be told when and where I can see you, or I can or can't go to a movie with you. I thought of my girlfriend, Deborah. She was a dissident like me, and she was free to be with me, but she wasn't here. Suddenly, there was a wailing scream from across the street. Chills ripped up my spine into my neck. I jerked around and looked toward the sound. What the hell was that? Oh, it's just the police beating a suspect, said Jean offhandedly. That's the main police station there across the street. It's probably a communist. The sound of a motorcycle started up, competing with the screams. Doesn't this bother you? I asked Jean. Hearing somebody being tortured right beside the archaeological museum where you work? Stephen, one of the many things you don't know about Greece is what a threat the communists have been to us. The colonels aren't angels, no, but Athens has been peaceful since they took over. No, I don't mind screaming if it comes from a communist. I prefer it to the screaming of innocence in a burning car or building. But how do you know who they're beating in there? Lots of cops are thugs, don't you know that? And you're not clairvoyant, are you? I trust the police more than I do the dissidents, she said. Jean had a tour lined up. She got out. Goodbye then, Stephanie. Bye, Jean. This time it's for good. Wow. I sat there. I'm glad that happened. Don't want to spend another minute with her. The motorcycle across the street sputtered on. I have a lively, funny little section. You guys got enough patience for that? You're not too tired? Okay. I immediately found the base radio station, which was a armed forces radio station. It was totally unmarked, so I had missed it. But then one day, there was Sly and the Family Stone playing in our communications squadron office. And that was because everyone else was gone except for me and my black friend, Trace Jackson. And I went to him and I said, "What is that, Trace? I love Sly." He says, "It's the base radio station." So I went over there. I immediately became friends with the guy who was the DJ because, as I said, I had just come from LBJ's radio station where I was a DJ and a music guy and a news guy. This guy's name was Barker. One night as Barker's jazz shift was winding down, a guy called in and said he was looking for American voices to dub a spaghetti western, one of those films made with a cheap international cast, hired for their faces, that a small studio then dubs into several languages. Barker just handed me the phone. That's how I met Alan Wenger. He had a smooth baritone voice with a touch of New York accent. Alan invited us to join him that night and some friends at Kolonaki Square after 11 so we could talk about the dubbing gig. I'd heard that Kolonaki, located between the Acropolis and Lycabettus Hill, was the most trendy, happening square in Athens. It was said to be jammed with chic designer shops, cafes, people hanging out, being seen and seeing. Barker said the scene just gets started at 11, buzzing on to the wee hours. When Barker's show ended, we drove in my VW Bug past the Hilton Hotel to the edge of downtown, where two 6-lane roads merged. It looked like everybody with a car was merging, honking, yelling, and rubbernecking out their windows. I eased the gray VW into the tide of little sardine cars, lots of Fiat 500s, the smallest car ever mass-produced. Half the cars needed a muffler job and the other half were honking. I was sure I was going to get T-boned. The guy ahead of me stuck his hand out of the driver in front of him, fingers spread wide. "That's right, buddy, give him 5, said Barker. "What's that?" I said. Giving 5 for Greeks is roughly like giving the finger, only you give all 5. Means the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Mary Magdalene, and like another saint of your choice. Something like that. May they all curse you, asshole. It's no surprise, Steve. Greece has the highest traffic deaths per capita in Europe and in vehicular fights over nothing. So be careful on this roundabout. This was the first traffic circle or roundabout, as the Brits called them I'd ever seen. We were rotating on the outer edge of this traffic whirlpool, and I missed our turnoff. I put on my signal and looked to go inward a layer, and of course, the guy next to me stood on his horn and gave me 5. "Fuck him," said Barker, rolled down his window and gave him 5 over the top of the car. This was like big boy bumper cars at the state fair. The guy looked at us with his eyes bugging out and threw 2 5s at us, letting go of the wheel and yelling some obscenity. I pressed on the brake pedal. A horn immediately blared behind me. "Don't hit the brakes," yelled Barker. "There's always somebody right behind you. Just let off on the gas." The exhaust fumes were nauseating. At least they weren't throwing tire irons or beer bottles. Just 5. Thank you guys so much for coming. This book is a weaving of a coming-of-age story for a young English nerd, myself. The U.S. Air Force pretending to just be passing communications through Greece on to Turkey for NATO. As it happens, when Donna set up this wonderful trip for us to Novato, California, just north of the Bay Area, that has a Grecian festival. And it was totally, totally monster. 3,000 to 500 people on 2 days. And a 100-year-old guy came up to me. And he said, and Donna actually started giving him the spiel. She was better at giving the spiel about my book than I was. I had a cold and a cough. And this guy had a cane, but he was motoring around through these fantastic crowds. And he came and tapped me on the shoulder and he said, "From one Steve to another." I went, "Wow, okay, who are you?" He says, "I'm Colonel Steve Sadamannis," or something like that. And he said, "I worked for Colonel Gus Francis. He set up the coup for the Greek colonels. Good to meet you." That was truly the highlight, and I got home and I Googled Gus Francis, and he was born Gus Cavafy and was the NATO liaison in Athens on the day of the coup. So I may have a clue that everybody on the Modern Greek Studies Association listserv doesn't have, and that is, were the Americans directly involved in the coup? From one Steve to another, I think I just found out that they were. Does anybody have any questions about any of that stuff? Or I know you got to leave. You got your purse going. And that's,
I want to buy the book.
oh, okay. You didn't buy the book. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
Have you been back to Greece since then?
Donna and I went back in 2009. That's when all these photos were taken. I had started in 2006 when we were involved in the Abu Ghraib torture scandal. Remember the horrible prison where they had obvious disrespectful and hideous torture being done on our behalf or by us? And I started thinking, I knew people who tortured. My friend Alan that I mentioned, sort of the climax of the book is that Alan gets caught by the secret police. And I won't tell you how that all works out, but I thought my best friend almost got tortured, and I never wrote a book because I thought the Vietnam era is dominated by people who were in the war zone in Vietnam, who rode helicopters and dropped napalm and had their friends brought home in a body bag. And then I thought, I got to write this story anyway. So in 06, I found both Alan Wenger and Jim Como living a mile from each other in Paris, not knowing each other. And so through the search engines, I got French movie sites and French music sites that gave me people to call to, and I got a hold of both of them, and they said, sure, come on over. And so, of course, I had to. I mean, you know, you have to go to Paris when someone asks you to. And it was a fantastic adventure, and I learned how much of my memory had been processed and that I had conveniently shrink-wrapped and put on the mantelpiece of my memory. And a very important person in Athens was a young woman named Athena, and I found her in Athens. And this completely enriched and accelerated the writing of the book. But it was 09. I thought I'd never get back, but the story started driving me, and luckily we had a relative who died and left us some money, so we went over. And of course, Greece right now is in almost as bad a situation, maybe as bad, because the economy is completely trashed. And people are very upset, and like all of Europe, they're leaning to the right wing. There's a new right wing in Greece called Golden Dawn, and there's typical far right wing. So it's not a happy place now. Any other questions?
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
What I noticed with looking at military juntas after this, because my first experience was how comfortable people become quickly. And that's the whole kind of strategy, is feed them bread and circus.
Yeah. Yeah.
Circus and fix the roads and have the buses run on time.
By the time my friend Alan finally told me that he was in the Greek resistance, and Athena, they don't pronounce it Athena, they pronounce it Athena. And I completely humiliated myself by saying, and what does that mean? When I finally found out about it, my head was on fire. And I started asking Greeks that I knew. And they said, in '67 when this happened, you don't understand. Greece has been violent since World War II. Actually, it's been violent since the 30s. And people just thought, let's give them a go. They were so tired of left versus right with a weak monarch, Constantine. And so they said, let it happen. And it was students who finally kept throwing up barricades, and directly around the corner, just like you could throw a beer can and hit it, from where the motorcycle, from the Bouboulines main police station where the torturing was done, to the Archaeological National Museum where there are treasures of antiquity and the founding of democracy and the human form and individualism all happened, is Athens Tech. And those students really started off the final days of the colonels, because they made so much trouble that the colonels drove a tank and drove over through the gates, through the locked gates of the Athens Technological University, and just squashed about 30 students. And the students all over Greece said, that's it. And so everybody went out, and it was the students who precipitated their end in 1974, plus their stupid invasion of Cyprus, which was a absolute, I'm all right, Jack, comedy of hideous proportions. And there are still 1,500 people missing from Cyprus. And, You know, it was just like blunder, 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 and finally the Greek sort of what's left of the ruling elite and the middle class said, oh my God, we have to have a civilian government again. And those guys there are a couple of them still in prison. Others have died, but thank you guys so much.